Welcome back, artists. I'm Y Paints, and this week I'm finally answering a request I've had many times over this channel's lifetime to do a video focusing on thinning paints. Now, in the painting hobby, one of the most commonly asked questions is, how do I get better? And beyond the obvious of just practice, the most commonly responded answer is, you gotta thin your paints. Now, 9 times out of 10, it's the absolute correct answer. But unfortunately, those 3 words don't do a lot to convey all of the nuances that go into thinning your paint. But how much do I thin it? What do I thin it with? These unanswered questions usually do a lot more of making things worse than helping, sometimes frustrating the artist to the point of dropping the hobby altogether. Hopefully, by the end of this video, I'll be able to put a whole bunch more clarity where only mystery lies. But before we get to thinning, let's talk about paint for a second. This is gonna be a whole thing, isn't it? Yeah, but there's bookmarks, and it's always a good idea to have a good base of information. Acrylic paint is basically 3 parts: pigment, water, and medium. These 3 parts make up about 97% of your paint. The last 3% are additives for binding, color fastness, and for finish. While they're important, they're not really going to be the focus of this video, but just know they're there. Now, of the 3 main parts, each one has a very important function. First, the pigment. This is what gives your paint its color. This usually comes in the form of a dried powder that's ground very, very fine. The issue is we can't really just use this pigment on its own. As a powder, it's really hard to control. Even breathing on it will ruin things. Plus, a lot of times through history, the pigments that were used for paints were actually toxic, like lead and arsenic. Thankfully, none of the paints on your shelf should be unsafe, as they've been all replaced with non-toxic synthetics. Nonetheless, these powdered pigments need something to keep them from getting airborne and make them a bit easier to work with. That's where part 2 comes into play: water. Once you get the pigment into a solution, not only does it keep it from getting airborne, it also gives you a whole lot more control when repainting it on a surface. But there's a problem here, as most pigments are hydrophobic, meaning they do not want to mix with water at all. So getting it to mix evenly would be difficult. And that's where the 3rd part comes in: medium. The medium functions as an emulsifier, being sticky to the pigment while also dissolving into the water. So the pigment sticks to the medium, then the medium gets diluted in the water, and then you have paint. Now, how much paint, water, and pigment are in your paints is going to depend on your manufacturer. But of the 3 parts, the pigment is the most expensive, so you can usually tell a more premium paint by its higher pigment load. A budget brand like this craft paint is going to have a very low pigment load, while a more premium paint line like Army Painting here is going to have a much higher pigment load. This is the reason why, when bought in sets, this bottle's about 50 cents a piece, while this one's about $4 a piece. That's literally 8 times the price. And if we break it down by milliliter, it gets even wilder. While this one is 59 milliliters, that comes out to less than a penny per milliliter. While this little bottle is only 19, coming out to about 23 cents per milliliter. That's a huge difference. Why would I want to pay 23 times as much? Give me the craft paint. Well, not so fast. While saving money is great, a craft paint like this is going to cause you more headaches than it saves you money. Because the pigment is what really gives it its color, having a low pigment load is going to affect the paint in a lot of drastic ways. Because of the low pigment, this tends to need to be applied thickly, and when you do, it ends up drying uneven and leaving a patchy mess. So you'll end up needing multiple of those thick coats to end up with a less than decent job. For these reasons, I usually limit the craft paints to areas that I just need to cover a lot of surface. Once your surface area is moving from square centimeters to square meters, that price is gonna matter. Okay, don't use the cheap stuff, but if the fancy paint is so fancy, I should be able to use it straight out of the bottle. Well, sure, you can, and the paint is gonna paint, but you're gonna have some issues if you don't give it a little bit of attention first. Remember how I said the medium makes the pigment sticky? Well, it makes it so sticky that it wants to kick out the water out of the emulsion. So if your paint has been sitting on the shelf, the very first thing you need to do is shake the heck out of that paint. You really need to break up those pigment globs and get the water in there, making it nice and loosey-goosey. If you don't do this and you just pour straight out the bottle, what you really get is some paint tinted water. Thankfully, paint companies like Army Painter have started putting these little BBs in the bottle that makes shaking up your paints easy peasy. Okay, my paint is super shaken. I'm ready to paint, right? Well, not so fast. If we just load up that paintbrush and get going, all that stickiness is going to come to bite us in the butt. The pigment being this sticky, it doesn't matter what it sticks to. It'll stick to the surface just as much as it'll stick to other pigment. If we use the paint just as it is, the pigment is so thick, it's going to stack up randomly across the surface of your model. While you'll get good coverage, there will be inevitably high points on the surface. This is what's going to cause your model to have a rough looking texture. Even if you try to smooth this out with your brush, because the pigment is so thick, your bristles will end up cutting small valleys into it and leaving the dreaded brush strokes all over your surface, which goes against the main goal of this hobby, to paint a thing so that it doesn't look like it was painted. This is where thinning comes in to address those issues. Finally. Okay, calm down. Now, when we thin our paint, what we're doing is lowering the viscosity of the paint to make it easier for the pigments to flow by each other. A low viscosity paint will want to spread out on its own, dragging the pigment along with it. So you can think of the viscosity of a paint as its speed. The more thin the paint is, the faster it is. The thicker the paint, the slower it is. Now, in particular, the problem with thinning paint is that each paint is gonna need a different amount of thinning. Even paints from the same brand will need different amounts of thinning just because of the different pigments that are used to make the colors. So while some paints are going to need a lot of thinning, some may not need much at all. Plus, how much thinning a particular paint needs will actually change over time as the paint naturally starts to dry out. So how do we find out how much thinning a paint needs? Well, we have a tool that makes it super easy, the wet palette. Wait, I don't have one of those. That's okay, it's not a big deal. You can make one super easy with a plastic lid, a few paper towels, and a piece of parchment paper. Just wet down the paper towels and then put the piece of parchment on top. It's gonna curl a little bit at first, but just use your fingers and hold it down until it relaxes. Once it's down, put a few beads of water on top and you're ready to go. But why would I need to do that? I have a plastic palette. Well, the parchment is gonna give us a nice smooth surface to work with while also allowing water to pass through it. This is going to give us a lot of work time with our paint so it stays in that golden zone. Otherwise, you only have a couple of minutes or so before the water naturally evaporates from your paint and it gets thicker. This is why it's usually a good idea to only use a small amount of paint at a time and just add to it as you need to. Now, straight from the bottle, our paint is very slow. If I spread it around, it'll go where I tell it and just kind of stay there. To thin it, I'm going to first load up my brush with clean water and pull a touch of paint off from the main pool. This will be my thinned paint pool. If you take a look, you can see the paint doing something interesting. When I pull the paint across the parchment, it quickly pulls itself back to the main pool. At this point, we have a very fast paint. A little bit too fast. To thicken it up, I dragged a bit more paint from the pool and kept testing it to see how fast it was. As you add more and more paint, the retraction back to the pool will slow down. The aim is to dial in the right mix so that the paint still retracts, but it does so very slowly. If the paint stops retracting, you went a touch too far and you'll need to add a bit more water. Once you hit that balance point, your paint is ready. This, in my opinion, is the perfect thinness for base coats. At this point, you'll want to take a real good look at your paint and try to memorize how thick it is. With a bit of practice, you'll be able to recreate this speed by feel. It's sort of like riding a bike. Once you get comfortable to it, you won't need the training wheels of the wet palette to help you through it. Now, by its nature, thinned down paint most likely won't cover a surface completely in one coat, but usually 2 will be enough for most colors outside whites and warm tones like yellow, orange, and red. These can easily take 3 or more. But with thinned down paint, putting on 3, 4, or even 7 coats will be thinner and smoother than even just 1 coat of unthinned paint, leaving you with a much better final result. And that's it. That can't be it. Okay, it's not it. There is a little bit more. I knew it. The thinning we did is just for your base coats, which is your first touches of paint. When you want to put a second color on top or layer, you're gonna want to add a bit more water to thin it down even more. This will add to the transparency and allow the first color to show through. Just like before, I'm gonna pull some paint with some water in to make it nice and fast. But instead, this time, I'm gonna look for the halfway point between the slowest retraction and too fast. It will take a little bit of practice to recognize it, but you thankfully will have some signs if you've gone too far. If you see any bubbles like this, well, slow down because you're breaking the paint. Getting these onto your project would be worrisome. Time to add a little bit more paint and try again. But what about washes and glazes? All right, you're a little pushed, but okay. For those, it's time to switch what we're using to thin. Water, while very good, has its limitations. Because paint is an emulsion, if we overload it with too much water, it breaks that emulsion and basically falls apart. So in those cases, when I really need to thin down a paint, I switch to medium. Now, there's a lot of different mediums you can use, like crackle medium and metal medium, and those deserve its own video. For now, the mediums I'm gonna look at are thinner, glaze, and airbrush medium. For the Fanatic line, they call it stabilizer. We can add a whole lot more of them to the paint without breaking cohesion. This is the reason why I always opt for medium when I'm thinning metallics. The large particle size of the metallic pigments will cause the paint to break earlier with a lot less water than regular paint. Well, why don't you just use medium all the time? Well, mainly money. These bottles are priced about the same as the paint, while water I can get out of my tap for pennies to the gallon. If you've got the fat stacks to always thin with medium, well, have at it. Me, I'm poor. Why didn't you just start with that? Have you seen how long this video is? Like I said, it's like riding a bike. Once you get comfortable doing it, you can kind of just do it by feel and know how much you need to thin each paint. And recognizing how much and how to thin each individual paint is one of those important steps on improving as a painter. Lastly, before I wrap this up, I do want to touch on a bit of brush control. Now, when you load up the paint, you're gonna want to make sure you wick off all the excess. You don't want this to flood off your brush as soon as you touch your model. So touching the back of your hand with your brush before you touch a model helps do away a lot of excess paint on your brush. Ultimately, when you touch your brush to your model, you want it to come off like you were painting with a marker, just a flat slick of color. If you get this, you're gonna have smooth sailing. Hopefully, this video demystified thinning paints for you. Be sure to give it a try and practice with thinning your paints on each and every project you do. I guarantee you're gonna see an improvement on your work. If you like this video and you wanna see more deep dives in specific techniques like skin or stippling or whatever, be sure to let me know in the comments below. And it'd be pretty awesome if you gave me a like. It seemed like YouTube likes it when you like stuff. And before I end this, I'd like to take a quick second to thank all my subscribers over on Patreon. Month after month, you continue to throw your support behind me, not only keeping the lights on, it's also a constant reminder that somebody out there wants me to make more of this stuff. For that, I truly can't thank you enough. And I get to share the madness. If you would like to join the Painting Pantheon, you'll find a link to my Patreon below. But as always, thank you for watching. Stay creative and always enjoy the process.